when we read about him in Luke particularly, or Matthew, I should say. Matthew 2 is where we mostly read that story. And when we read about Herod, there's obviously some things that we know about him we can get from the text. And then not too far later, you read about another Herod, and you're like, well, who's this Herod? Later on, you read about another Herod, and then the Apostle Paul's dealing with the Herod, and you're like, all right, I'm not sure who we're talking about here. So hopefully this will give some kind of help to distinguish. If nothing else, it'll help you remember when you read about a Herod, okay, this isn't necessarily the Herod that tried to kill Jesus or whatever. But first we'll start in Luke chapter 1, where we read in this story about a man which is known by Herod the Great, who is the patriarch of this family. So like every Herod that is known from this point forward, this dynasty, if you will, comes from this first Herod. He's the original one, right? The one that we'll read about here in a second. Now, along with many kings and dynasties throughout history, worldwide, even the United States has had our share of leaders, rulers, not necessarily a dynasty, not necessarily as powerful as a king, just because of the way our government is supposed to be set up. But certainly you can see power gets to people's heads, and wickedness is allowed to go. There's been some debate. I just heard recently that Nixon, I believe it was Nixon who said, no, I don't think it was Nixon. I don't know, it might have been Jimmy Carter. I can't remember, but one of the presidents verbalized this. He felt like, hey, I think it was Nixon, when a president does something, like even if it was an illegal thing, like he voiced this thing, and I'm totally messing up, I don't have a quote in front of me or anything, but he expressed this idea that, hey, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Like, the president can get away with it because he's got all the power. Now, to some degree, it's true. I mean, you can impeach them, you can do all these things, but they tend to get away with a lot of things. It's just kind of one of the luxuries of being in that position. But man, multiply that exponentially. We have kings and examples all throughout history of people, and mainly in other countries, who, this has been carried out way worse, to the extent of getting away with killing people and all kinds of weird things that all of the peasants have to just kind of watch them do it and not say anything about it. We even see David falling into that a little bit, King David in the Bible. And so it's certainly something to consider, that this power goes to the head. All right, so I think everybody has that handout now, just so you can look at this, and I'll explain it a little bit here in a second. But you'll notice this, that and I'm not going to deal with a lot of history. I'm mostly just looking at what the Bible says about these guys. But I'll have to resort to history a little bit just to get us just a couple of little facts about these guys, just to help us understand some things. But you'll notice if you study these guys in history, that there's a lot of murders. No surprise, kings throughout history, all throughout the world, are murdering people. We see that in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1, 2 Chronicles. Lots of people trying to overthrow the kings, and large groups of people killed and wiped out. Nothing new. It continued to go on throughout history, and in Herod's day, it was the same way. Another thing that you'll find a lot of, and we'll point this out here a little bit, is incest. Okay, again, a lot of dynasties, a lot of jokes made about England and incest happening, and so anyway, there's jokes about that, but it's true. A lot of kingdoms married within the family to keep power and keep things a certain way, and so a lot of times they'll marry their cousins or their aunts or whoever, and or even worse. So there's also a lot of divorce and remarriage within the family. I didn't like this guy, so I'll marry his brother. And it shouldn't be surprising when you hear these stories, because it was we consider a pretty wicked and dysfunctional family. But if you study, again, most kings throughout history, you'll find a lot of dysfunctional families. All right, so again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the history. I'll bring up a few little facts that I found in my research, but mostly we're just going to look these stories up in the Bible and talk about who is who. And so first, I want you to notice again, like I said, the first king that we're dealing with is Herod the Great. And when I say king, you have to realize too that there's no king that sat in the throne after they went into captivity. There was no king over Israel. So when we say King Herod, he wasn't really a king. He was under the authority of the Roman Empire, but he was put there, to be like a vassal king. So it's not a real king. He didn't really have the ultimate authority, but he had enough, again, for this power to go to his head. And hey, if you rub the elbows with the Roman emperor or with the Roman leaders, you'll have more power and all this. Certainly wasn't a good Jew by the Jewish standard, and not a Christian by any means. Now you'll see in that handout I gave you that Herod the Great, which is the one we're going to read about first in Luke 1, had all these different wives, and I believe he had 10 wives. So this isn't even an exhaustive list. This is just the main ones that we hear about in history. And as it relates to those that are in the Bible, it's even less. It's only a few of the wives that are on this list who would even be mentioned in the Bible. So no surprise, a lot of kings have had lots of wives, even throughout the Bible. We see that. Okay, so let's talk about this first Herod, which is known as Herod the Great. And it's not great because he was a great person in the sense of like a good king. He was great as in like just powerful, and I guess it could even go to the fact that he was the patriarch of all of this lineage. Okay, so let's go ahead and read. Let's start with verse 5, Luke chapter 1, verse 5. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah of the course of Abiah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Her name was, did I read that right? I got mixed up. Okay. Yeah, there was in the days of Herod, and then it talks about this priest, Zechariah, and his wife was Elizabeth. Okay. Sorry, I messed that up. But I wanted you to see that in the days of Herod, the stuff that we read about Zacharias is there. Now, Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. This is the story we're familiar with. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to worship to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes and the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, and thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed in their own country another way. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. And be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. Okay? And then we'll talk about verse 22 in a second. So this is the Herod we're all familiar with, Herod the Great, who, according to the Bible, which obviously we believe, sends to have all the children, 2 and younger, murdered, all the male children, murdered, so that there will be anybody there that could potentially become the king of the Jews. Now, modern scholarship disagrees and says, hey, there's no other evidence that children were killed in this way, and even the other gospel accounts, they don't record that, and so this must have been added in the book of Matthew or something like that. But here's the thing, and I think I've brought this up before in a past message. Here's the thing. Number one, Bethlehem was a pretty small town. Like, there's a reason we call it Old Little Town of Bethlehem. It wasn't a huge town. And so for him to go in there where the child was born and to kill all these people, it probably wasn't as significant as tons of other things that other kings have done in the past. And this king particularly, it said that he had done lots of stuff like that and had family members killed and all this kind of stuff to avoid people overrule. Because kings, a lot of times at the end of their reign, start getting paranoid about people trying to kill them or overthrow them. And so, it stands to reason that this wasn't something that was just recorded and talked about by everybody. It's in the Bible. We believe this is the inspired word of God, and so we're not questioning that at all. But there are people out there that say that there are no other records of that. But here in the text, he does give a prophecy from the Old Testament. It says that, hey, this was that crying that was going on. When we read, it obviously lines up in a picture with Moses whenever he's, supposed to, Pharaoh's trying to kill all the children and they hide him. And then when we read in Revelation 12 about the dragon trying to kill the child, I mean, there's a lot of things that it fits into the narrative of the whole Bible. So why it's not elsewhere and why there's not a lot of records about a king doing that, I don't know. I mean, those rulers are the ones that wrote history. They didn't care to put that in there. But we did get it in the book of Matthew. So this is the Herod, okay, the first Herod, Herod the Great. And Herod, I think, means hero in Greek, something along those lines. So it was a name that was just given as this, like, a great person. Now, it was the name, it's what he was called. I don't know that you could compare it to like Caesar. A lot of people think Caesar is a person, but actually Caesar was just, there were lots of Caesars. And similar with Herod, there's a bunch of Herods, and it has to do with the importance of the person. But, maybe similar to what we would have now as a last name to keep, your lineage, but make a name for yourself. So that's Herod the Great. And then the next Herod we'll talk about is in verse 22 there, where it says, but when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither, notwithstanding being warned of God. In a dream, he turned aside in the parts of Galilee. Okay, so this is another Herod, actually. Now, I still added him to the text, even though in the Bible he's never called a Herod. But if anybody studying history understood that this guy was still called Herod, then when they read about other Herods, they might be confused and wonder if this is the guy that we're talking about. But not much is said about him. What I understand from just doing some search with history is that he was one of the Herods that just wasn't really, nobody liked him. Like, he wasn't a good ruler. Apparently his wife must have been Samaritan or something, because he's some kind of, or maybe Herod the Great's wife was Samaritan. I don't know that his mother, but somehow he was like, he represented Samaria and Judea. So he wasn't well liked by anybody, basically. And from what I understand from history, he didn't really do anything significant, and so there's not really much to say about him. But we know this from Matthew 2, that he causes Joseph to go to Nazareth instead of going back to Jerusalem, which would have, or to Bethlehem, which would have at that point been another Herod's. I think Herod Philip II would have been his reign. So there's not much else to say about him, but that's another Herod, Archelaus, that was known around that time. Okay, number 3 would be who's known in history as Herod Antipas. And in the Bible, it calls him Herod the Tetrarch. Okay, so let me explain what Tetrarch is. Tetra means 4. And so apparently the kingdom was divided up into 4 places. And so Herod the Great put his sons in position into those 4 different places. And so you've got, Herod Philip I, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip II. Okay, so these are the guys that are ruling in that region. I don't know what all the other sons did. Like I said, there were a lot more Herods in history, and more wives that Herod the Great married. But we have Herod the Great, we have Herod Archelaus, and then we have Herod the Tetrarch. Okay, so let's go to Matthew 14. And one of the things that gets real confusing is there are some, because these kings are, and again, I keep calling them kings, the Bible calls them kings, so it's okay to say that, but recognize they didn't actually have rule as a king over that land. They were just kind of, it's almost more like being a governor. Okay, so this was the king who we'll know by the story is the one who had John the Baptist killed. All right, so the confusing part is then you read several chapters later and you have him being the same king who tries Jesus. He's at the trial of Jesus. So again, it gets real confusing as you're reading, because you're like, wait a minute, is this the same Herod? Because there's a lot of different Herods. Well, it has to do with what region they're in. Okay, so if they're back in Galilee, it's going to be this Herod, and so a lot of these are alive during the same time period. It's just they're represented in different territories. And so it makes it real confusing. You're like, whoa, I thought, he was fleeing from Herod, and now there's another Herod, and so it can be kind of confusing. Okay, so Herod Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch, Matthew chapter 14. We see the story of John the Baptist being killed, and it says, let's see here. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. For Herod had laid hold on John, and bound him, and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. For John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them, and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, Give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was sorry, nevertheless, his for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. So he's sorry, he doesn't really want to do this, but for the sake of the oath and the sake of, hey, all these guys listen to me give this oath, and I'm not going to feel like a man if I don't, honor this, he goes ahead and allows John the Baptist to be beheaded and the head put into a charger and given. What a weird thing to ask for. What a weird thing for her. Even though Herodias, his wife, was upset with him, with John the Baptist, what a weird thing for her to ask her daughter to ask for. So there's just so many weird things here, but we'll talk a little bit more about Herodias in a second. And so he sent and beheaded John in prison, and his head was brought in the charger and given to the damsel. And this just tells you again about what the times were like and how wicked people could be. She brought it to her mother, and his disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Okay, let's go to Mark chapter 6. And so, by the way, you can imagine the apostles who loved John the Baptist and respected him are now not too happy with Herod, who had this done. And then Jesus, who's really good friends with, even related to John the Baptist, is really going to be upset with Herod as well. Again, the Bible says, be angry and sin not. He's not sinning because he's angry at Herod. He's rightfully angry with Herod for what he did. All right, so Mark chapter 6 and verse 14. And King Herod heard of him, for his name was spread abroad, and he said that John the Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. So you see, he's kind of paranoid, and when he sees Jesus doing these great works, he's like, oh no, this is John the Baptist. And, it's like his spirit, like some supernatural spirit that's going into Jesus now that he's dead. And so it says, others said that it's Elijah, and others said that it is a prophet or one of the prophets. That's what the Muslims still say today. But when Herod heard thereof, he said, it is John whom I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. For Herod himself hath sent forth and laid hold upon John and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. And John had said unto Herod, it is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. Therefore Herodias had a quarrel against him and would have killed him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and holy, and observed him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. And when a convenient day was come, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. And when the daughter of the said Herodias came in and danced, and pleased Herod and them that sat with him, the king said unto the damsel, ask of me whatever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. And he sware unto her, whatsoever thou shalt ask of me, I will give it thee unto the half of my kingdom. And she went forth and said unto her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John Baptist. And she came in straightway with haste into the king, and asked, saying, I will that thou give me by and by in a charger the head of John the Baptist. And the king was exceeding sorry, yet for the oath's sake and for their sake, which sat with him, he would not reject her. And immediately the king sent, and now I won't keep going, but you see, sound almost exactly the same, but there's slight little differences there. But Matthew, Mark both talk about that. Luke talks about it. We'll just read Luke chapter 3, 19 and 20. But Herod the Tetrarch, he's called again, being reproved by him for Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, and for all the evils which Herod had done, added yet this above all, that he shut up John in prison. Okay, so this is, again, talking about the same Herod, which is, in the Bible, it's called Herod the Tetrarch, but also history calls him Herod Antipas. And he's the one that killed John the Baptist. Also, like I said, he's the one who had Jesus at trial. Now, I want to talk about how Jesus treats Herod, because he doesn't respect him. He doesn't actually give him honor, like somebody might think he would do. A lot of people think that Jesus would never, be ugly or be rude to somebody. But look at Mark chapter 8 to start with. Come right back to Luke, but Mark chapter 8 and verse 15 says, "And he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod." Okay, so he's saying that be careful for Herod. He's not a good guy, basically, is what he's saying. Okay, and then we also find in Luke chapter 14, and this kind of confirms that other passage, right? Take heed of the leaven, right? What's leaven do? It leavens the whole lump. It affects people. Like, it doesn't look like much at first, but then it grows and festers. And so here's what he calls them in Luke 14. Go to verse 31. What did I do here? Luke 14, 31, 32. That's not it. Let's see here. Oh, I don't know what I did to mess that up. All right, let me look something up real fast. It's just a study anyway. I'm not trying to impress anybody. All right, here we go. All right, so it is actually Luke 13:32, okay? Back 13:32. And he said, let's start with 31 actually. "The same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying unto him, Get thee out and depart hence, for Herod will kill thee." All right, they're telling Jesus, "Hey, you get out of here, Herod's going to kill you." And here's Jesus' response. He said unto them, "Go ye and tell that fox, Behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I will be perfected." Okay, so he's like, go tell that guy, but he calls him a fox. All right, now what do we know about foxes? We talk about all the time how foxes are sly, that sly old fox, and stuff like that. And so this idea was, hey, that guy's a trickster. He's a he might pretend that he likes you. He might pretend, just like he pretended like he liked John the Baptist. I mean, who knows what all emotions were involved there, but it's like, that guy is a fox. And that's not a compliment. Okay, nowadays sometimes people use fox for compliment, but that wasn't a compliment. It was a bad thing. All right, Jesus was not giving him respect. Now then on trial, you can go to Luke 23 and see Jesus on trial. Acts chapter 4 talks about it as well, but we won't go there. Luke 23, verse 7. "And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracles done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him." And of course, then Herod has him mocked and treated badly. But at the time, he's excited to see him. He's like, "Oh, I want to talk to this man. I heard he does all these miracles," and he was interested in him. And then he asks him some questions, and Jesus just ignores him. He doesn't even speak a word to him. And so it seems kind of rebellious, but the idea was, hey, this is a wicked guy. I've got nothing to say to him. I'm not going to even entertain the thought. Okay? So we see this is the same Herod that had John the Baptist murdered, which probably is part of the reason why he's being treated that way, because, the guys are pretty upset with him. He's not a good guy at all. And so there's no reason for him to be respected. Okay, now we've talked about Herod the Great, and then now we're talking about his sons, Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch. The next one is Herod Philip. Okay, now this would be Philip II. There is another Philip, but we won't talk much about him. But there's a Philip. This is Philip II, who is also called Philip the Tetrarch. Okay, but he was a Herod Philip, and called Herod the Tetrarch in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, okay, so that's the real king. It's not Herod, but they just called him the Caesar. Pontius Pilate being governor over Judea, and Herod being the Tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip Tetrarch of Iturea in the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias, the Tetrarch of Abilene. So anyway, this Philip that's talked about, this is Philip Tetrarch. And now Philip, this is, not much is said about him. Now, this is not the Philip that was the brother of Herod Antipas that he stole his wife from, okay? But this Philip, the other Philip would be his brother, and this Philip married Herodias, Herodias' daughter that danced before Herod. Her name was Salome, something like that. And this guy marries her, so that he's marrying his niece, right, who was this, wicked girl. Her mother was wicked. And so there's a lot of incest and weird stuff going on, as I've mentioned before. So this guy, Herod Philip II, or Philip the Tetrarch, not a whole lot is said of him, but apparently he marries Salome, and that's all really history says about him. Okay, but we just know he's mentioned in this. He's just talking about the different people that are reigning over these different places, and Philip II is one of them. All right, number 5 is Herod Agrippa the First. Okay, now this is a story. You got to go to Acts chapter 12. And there's only one more after this, so don't worry. Acts chapter 12. So yeah, the other Herod Philip that married Herodias to begin with, that was Philip I. We didn't really talk about him, but he is mentioned there where it talks about John the Baptist saying that he shouldn't have Philip's wife. All right, Acts chapter 12 says, "Now about the time Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw it please the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread." And of course, in this story, he takes Peter, but then God allows Peter to be broke free, and he gets away. Okay, but it didn't stop James. James the apostle does get martyred at the hands of this Herod. Okay, so Herod Agrippa the First. And we also find out, as you keep reading in chapter 12, that he is lifted up in pride. He's a very prideful man. He's very arrogant, wants people to respect him and give him power and all this kind of stuff. And so we see the end of his life, which the Jewish historian Josephus also gives some details on. But it says here in verse 20, "And Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon, but they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus the king's chamberlain their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. And upon the set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. And the people gave a shout, saying, It is the voice of a God and not a man. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost." So what a great ending to one of these Herods, who was arrayed in gorgeous apparel and wanted everybody to, think highly of him. And here they are thinking highly of him. They're like, "Oh, it's the voice of a God." They're probably just flattering him. They probably don't really think that highly of him, but that's what they're saying. And instead of rebuking them and saying, "Hey, don't say that," I'm not a god, He just goes ahead and eats that up. So therefore, worms eat him up. Okay, so that would be Herod Agrippa the first. And then the last Herod that we mentioned, who actually ends up being kind of the last significant Agrippa in history, Herod in history, is this Agrippa the second. So, and in this story, I don't think he's ever called Herod. I think he's just called Agrippa, but I'll still go there. Acts chapter 23. Acts 23. But again, these are all sons of Herod the Great that tries to have Jesus killed. Sons or grandsons. I think one case it's a grandson. All right, so let's see here. What did I say? Acts 23, verse 35. Says, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers also are come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. Okay, so this was place where the Herods ruled. And in this case, it would be Agrippa the second. So in chapter 25, we see the story of him. He finally comes and he listens to the trial of Paul. And so verse 13, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice, that would be his wife, and those are mentioned in that diagram you have there too. That Herod Agrippa the first has two daughters, Bernice and Drusilla. So, and then also so this is his sister. Anyway, she's mentioned, and also Drusilla is mentioned in Acts 24. But let's keep reading. And he goes to Caesar, came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. So basically he's just saying, hey, the Jews are complaining about this guy, so here he is on trial. We're going to see what to do about him, this Apostle Paul. Well, it turns out that Agrippa II is actually, again, kind of interested in what's going on. And he's interested in this character, Paul, and he wants to hear from him himself. And so he gives him an opportunity to speak in verse, let's see, well, you can read the rest of the chapter. He begins appealing, and he takes a opportunity to preach the gospel. Really, in let's see, verse in chapter 26. I'm trying to, for the sake of time, move on here, but he gives an opportunity to kind of preach the gospel, and he's telling Agrippa, I shouldn't be here, but let me just tell you who Jesus is. And he's going on in detail, all this through chapter 26. The significant thing about this Agrippa that will ring a bell with you is in verse 24. So he says in chapter 26, verse 24, and as he thus spake for himself, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, thou art beside thyself. Much learning doth make thee mad. It's like you're just like, you sound very studious. You sound like you know what you're talking about, but obviously much learning has made you mad. But he said, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak forth the words of truth and soberness. And so Festus, is saying this about him. But then he addresses King Agrippa. Look at verse 27. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. I don't know what he knew about Agrippa II, but he knows that he understands the Jewish ways and should believe the Gospels and the prophets. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. And when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor, and Bernice, and they that sat with them. And when they had gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, this man doth nothing worthy of death or of bonds? Then said Agrippa unto Festus, this man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. And so anyway, the final Herod that we see, Herod Agrippa II, actually is partly responsible for releasing Paul. Now, he still goes on a trial and he still ends up with some kind of punishment, house arrest or whatever. But Agrippa has the opportunity to try him, and he says, well, he hasn't done anything wrong. And he's like, hey, he'd get free if he hadn't appealed. And so now he has to go see Caesar. And so it's quite interesting, that famous line where he says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. I didn't obviously become a Christian unless there's more to the story that we don't know. But it does show that the Apostle Paul had the opportunity to preach to him, which if you remember, when Paul gets converted on the, when he's going to Damascus and he gets converted, he says, he sends him to Ananias, and the Lord tells Ananias, hey, this guy is going to speak to Gentiles, and he's going to speak to kings, and he's going to speak to the Jews. And so he is already prophesied that he's going to talk in front of influential and great people, which he does. And so the same should be true. I'll kind of make a conclusion here, give us some kind of application to take away from this. It's obviously just a study, but some application would be that there is a time and a place to try to reach leaders and governors and rulers of this world, even though, there are a lot of times it's kind of out of our hands what we can actually do. But especially in our situation, in our society, it's a little easier for us to get involved to some degree. And there's a place to do that. There's some people that are called to go before rulers and leaders and preach to them, take every opportunity. Some people get arrested and they actually preach in jails, and they preach to the jailers and all that. And so certainly possible. But if I could just make a few applications here from this story. Number one, it's easy for power to go to someone's head. And we should never seek power just for the sake of having power. We should never seek riches just for the sake of having lots of money, having lots of riches and wealth. Because if you're not prepared for that, you don't want it, because God it'll give it to you, and it'll go to your head, and it'll be a big problem. Solomon couldn't handle it. David struggled with it at a point. And so obviously these unsaved kings, it goes to their head. And every king in this nation, every ruler in this nation, presidents included, presidents of the United States, they are going to have a struggle. It would be hard for Christians, good Christians who believe the Bible, to go into politics for sure. But certainly there's a time and a place for us to preach and to be influential. Though we should try to live in peace, and we should try to do what the law tells us to do for the most part, not to throw fits about it and everything. Hey, it's okay to take issue with wicked rulers. You're not sinning against God by condemning some wicked ruler that has done something and pointing out the fact that he's wicked for doing it. Okay, Jesus called Herod the fox, that old fox. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I think about when people just going on and on about Trump as if he's just some untouchable, just perfect guy. And I remember his whole reign saying, no, he's not a good guy. There's a lot of wicked stuff that he has done and he continues to do. And there's pride and there's arrogance and there's all these things. And, would I say that to his face if he was in this room? I don't know. But there's certainly, I'd be within my rights to do it. John the Baptist certainly would have done it. Jesus wouldn't have any issues with that. And so, it is, even though we should live at peace and we shouldn't go around causing trouble, it's not a sin to recognize and to condemn the wickedness of our rulers. And then another thing is that God can use wicked rulers to help the cause of his children. In this case, he kind of used him in the life of Paul. And, that's something to consider, that no matter how wicked a ruler is or a leader of our city or, our county or whatever, God can use them. Like we can try. There's nothing wrong with voting. There's nothing wrong with considering, hey, who's the best candidate and what does he stand for and what are his beliefs or whatever. But at the end of the day, even if a wicked person gets in there, God's the one that you need to appeal to. God's the one you need to pray to and say, like, we want peace. We want to be able to serve you and do our job. And so I'm praying for this king. I'm praying for this ruler, that you would open his eyes. And it could be that God would allow those people to make some rules and to enforce some things that would actually help us as Christians just trying to serve the Lord and do his work. So those are just some things to consider. But mainly, I just want to take a look at the different Herods so you'll know, hey, there's a handful of them. There's a lot more Herods than that, but even in the Bible, you're talking about 5, 6 different people. I think 4 that actually say Herod, and then there's a couple others that are Herods, even though the Bible doesn't use the name Herod, but all from the same dynasty, all from the same person, Herod the Great. All right? Well, I hope that blessed your heart tonight. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for your word, and certainly a lot of people out there try to destroy it and shed or bring up accusations about it and condemn it. And I know there are people that don't agree with all the history, how it lines up in the Bible, and they try to bring up discrepancies and all that. But we know that your word is accurate, and we know that even history is very clear that these kings existed and how wicked they were, and nothing contradicts Scripture as far as we're concerned. So, Lord, I pray you just help us to get out from what we can out of this message in regards to rulers, and particularly what we see with this Herod family. And I pray, Lord, that you just help us keep serving you, following you, and in the midst of a wicked world, and just seek to please you in all things. And I pray that you help us do that in Jesus' name. Amen.